Working with video in Photoshop is an interesting experience. And there are some capabilities in Photoshop that are unique to working in Photoshop when you are working on a timeline. If I construct a new file, we'll see that we have our default templates that we can work with, and the one that I want to access is film and video. When I do that, we will notice what it comes up with here. We can see that we have different video settings. So if I know the size or type of video that I'm working with, I can choose that. We can see how it comes up with our pixel dimensions. Video is always done at 72 pixels per inch. The standard default of HD TV at 1080p is what we want. It gives us a 1920 by 1080 pixel size document, which is the standard size for HD video. And when I click on OK, I see that my video comes up, and by choosing this template, it automatically has opened a window that we did not have open prior, and that is my timeline panel. Under the window pull-down menu, I can see there is timeline. I can get rid of it, or I can pull it back. But by default, it does add that to the window when I create a video template document. Down in that panel, we can see that we have an option for create a video timeline. So a video timeline requires the use of video layers. So layers are going to work a little bit differently when we are working with a video timeline. There are two kinds of video or timelines that we can create. We can do a frame animation timeline, and we can also do a video timeline. Now the frame animation timeline is a little bit different. This is previously what the timeline option was in Photoshop, and it commonly was used for creating animated GIFs because they are going to be a short series of frames. Any type of video that we are going to be doing with Photoshop generally is going to be relatively short. You would not be editing a long form video here. That would just be an exercise in frustration. At that point, you would want to switch to Adobe Premiere for doing your editing. If you want to do a lot of effects, you would be using Adobe After Effects as your tools of choice. So before we dive deeper into the video timeline, we are going to look at Create Frame Animation and see what happens with that. So I will switch over from video timeline to frame animation, click on the button, and we can see it added a frame to my timeline. Now I am going to add a new layer, and on this layer I am going to not draw with the squishy brush because that's ugly. Go to a little harder brush. But I have now created a layer of artwork. Now that is layer 1. There's my background. We can see that is there. If we are using the frame animation timeline to create a project and are planning to make something that would be more like an animated GIF, we probably would not start with the full 1080 HD video timeline because normally GIFs are going to be a much smaller file when it's done. So we would start out smaller just to begin with. But for the purposes of what we're doing, it's fine to continue. Now, what we can do is we can see there is a frame. Now, if I want to take this frame, I can duplicate this frame on it, and we can go to frame 2 and duplicate it. Now, if I switch to my move tool and move my artwork on screen, we will see in the thumbnail where frame 1, the artwork is where I drew it. Frame 2, it is moved to a new location. Now, if I'm wanting, I could even add in now another frame and move my artwork to a new location. Add another frame, move my artwork to yet another location, and if I hit play, we will see how it moves around on screen. One thing that's nice is we do have the option, when we do this, we can tween our animation frames and say, I want to add 5 frames between my current frame and the next frame to slow down the march of that animation. And this reveals the real magic that's happening when we do frame-based animation inside Photoshop. We are able to automatically animate between frames, position, opacity, and effects applied to layers. But if I change the artwork, it will change the artwork across all of those frames. So if we think about what's happening is position, opacity, and effects are non-destructive parts that we can do to a layer. That non-destructive means we can automatically animate it. If I want to do transforming animation where my artwork is evolving or changing or modifying across frames, we have to approach things a little bit different. So non-destructive things, position, opacity, effects, can all be tweened or automatically controlled between our animation. So I will now click OK. We added in those frames, and now if I play my animation, we can see how it actually seems to be moving a little bit smoother. We're not limited to a single layer when we are animating, but I can now have a second layer that I could be working on. This is my blue face with a mustache. He's not sad, he has a mustache. And now if I go to my frames, we'll see how he has updated and is showing on all frames. At this frame, I could pull his opacity down. We can see in the thumbnail, it's only affecting that frame. I can now go over to this frame. I could move him to a new position. I can see this frame, he's back at that position. So we have the ability to move position, opacity, and we can also do effects. So if I choose effects here, I could now say my drop shadow. I'll just choose that as a basic effect and kick the drop shadow up. Move it away from my artwork. So now we can see the drop shadow has been applied. There is no drop shadow on this next frame. So the effect is tied to that frame. What I could do is I can copy that effect, and you may realize as I'm doing this, it probably would have been a good idea to apply the effect to the layer before I started adding frames, so then it would be easier to work with animating it. So now I will paste that layer style on here, and now this time I will go into drop shadow. I'll move it over there so we will see that the drop shadow is changing from frame to frame. So the style or effect, the layer effect, which all of these can be animated across frames. So once again, position, opacity, effects, all of those can be animated, individual layers, so that if I have an individual layer that I am going to work with, I can go to frame 1, draw a dot. I'm going to add another layer, add a dot, go to another layer, add a dot, go to another layer. Now what you may notice is, oh, I'm still on frame 1. So now all of those layers are showing up on all these frames, but on frame 1, if I just want the first dot, on frame 2, I want the second dot. And on frame 3, third dot, frame 4, last dot. So if I go through these frames, we can see You can do frame by frame animation or transforming animation, but it occurs by turning layers themselves on and off. Not a very efficient way of working, but for a short animation that may only be 12 frames long, it's not a big deal. You do 12 drawings. If you're actually animating, that's a pretty normal operation to do. So I can do frame by frame animation. I can do tweening by modifying non-destructive properties of objects. And I can now adjust my animation. And my overall animation, if I watch it, I can set it up to loop once, loop 3 times, or loop forever, so it creates a permanent running loop. And when we're all done, the next thing we need to do is get it out of here. So I will first just save it before I do anything silly. And now we need to get this out of here. Looking at what my options are, we may think that we want to render this out as video. Now, if I'm going to do this as video, we can do it, and it will create video. I'll just go through the standard and leave my settings standard. We'll talk more about rendering video when we actually are working with some video files a little bit later this session. But the key thing is we are generally going to render a video as H.264. That is a compressed video format that preserves quality while making a small file size. That's the recommended standard that we want to use. If we do QuickTime, you will get really, really big fat files. So H.264 will be a smaller, more portable document that we can work with. So I will render that out. And that now gives me my animation. If we also under export we see save for web, this is now a place where we do have an option to render it out as a GIF, which will create a GIF image format, or GIF if you prefer. And we can see our looping options. We can choose once or forever or other. So I can, because it's still running and running and running. We shrink down, then we can hit play and see. So that's what our GIF animation will look like. And if I do that as a GIF, it's going to animate. Then I can hit done. It rendered it out. So that is save for web. It's a legacy option, but they haven't put that capacity in any of the other exporting options. So if you know you want to access that, that used to be under save as, and save for web used to be right there, but you don't have that. If I choose save as and save it out as a GIF, it's not going to give me all of the options that I want, and it won't save it as an animated GIF. So we have to use the save for web if you want to create an animated GIF using Photoshop. Starting in a new file, this time again using the film and video preset, I'm going to create a video timeline instead of a frame-based timeline. And when I do that, something magical has just happened. Is we will see where layer 0 showed up. It used to say background layer over here. If I go back to the frame animation, the background layers stayed. Video does not do it. The video layers are going to work a little bit differently as part of this. So right now I have layer 0, and that has nothing on it. But if I draw a yellow smiley face and put that on it. We can see our video is here. But there's no real content in my video. But working with it, if you remember before on the video, as I added the video or added the frames in, we were able to modify non-destructive properties of layers. We can do the same thing with a video timeline as well. So a non-destructive option on the layer, if I click next to it, we will see position, opacity, and style are now here and available. Next to each of those words is the icon for a stopwatch. The stopwatch is Adobe's way of saying, do you wish to keyframe this or change its property over time? And if you want to do that, you have to click to make that active, and it will automatically put in a keyframe at whatever place your playback head, this red line, is currently at. Now if I take my artwork and move my artwork now, you can see I moved it, and in my timeline it put in a keyframe. If I go to a different place in time, it automatically is putting in a keyframe. And now if I rewind and hit play, we can see how that animation is occurring. To create smooth animation, it's much easier to keyframe it than it is to tween it and insert a random number of frames that you choose and doing it frame by frame style. That's much harder to finesse or control as you work with it. Now I can change the duration of this. Right now it's defaulting to 5 seconds. Most Adobe programs, if you have a still image and you bring it in, it defaults the exposure of that to 5 seconds. That's what Adobe likes to do as its default. So if I stretch this out to have a little more time to animate, we will see now these keyframes that are here is I can now take that keyframe and I can move it, so then it's now at that point in time. If I want to insert a new keyframe, I can just move to that point in time, and if I wanted to tween opacity, I could insert a keyframe, go over to opacity, pull it down. We'll see that because there's only one keyframe in opacity, there's only one keyframe, and I pulled that keyframe down to 0, my artwork disappeared. But if I put a new keyframe in, and I can do that by clicking this button or by just changing the setting, both would work. I can now bring it back up to 100, and if I play, oh, I didn't get that cemented. Now it's done. So now if I hit play, which I can use the space bar as my play button, you'll also notice that the white background is moving with my artwork. And that's because layer 0 had a white background. I drew directly on top of that. That is why the background is moving with my artwork. Now if I want to bring it back up, go to the layer here, pull it back up to 100% so it comes back faster. Now when we play, come on. So the distance between those keyframes is a lot. It's less here, so that's why the transition happens slow than fast. The changeover time, how much you change versus how much time you give for that change to occur, whether it's position, opacity, or a layer effect, will create the impression of fast or slow movement or fast or slow animation. So this is just working with a single picture here. If I want, I can go and bring in video And we do that not by opening, not by dragging over. If I look under the layer pull down menu, I will see I have an option where I can choose, I can add in a new video layer, I can add in a video layer from file, but even easier is right down in my timeline, I can say add media. And at this point I can go find any media I have. So I have the animation that I just previously exported from my frame animation, and I'll just stick that in here because I have it. Now, if we look close here, we'll see that it's there, but that frame animation was really short. So if we're at the end of the video, we can see how it happens very, very quick. With my timeline here, we'll notice this is called Video Group 1. And if I look over in my layers, we see it says Video Group 1. So when I first created this, it created that Video Group 1 with layer 0. Now, we can see how it's adding these files to the end of that timeline. If I want to modify this or to cut it or adjust it, I can just go to the end of a clip and move it, and that changes my timing. I want to stretch something out or shorten it, we can pull it in or out, but it only will stretch to its maximum. It doesn't repeat a clip. I can click with the scissors and when I click on the scissors, it now cuts that video into its own separate element. But these are layer group 1, or video group 1. Now under add media, we'll see that I can now add media, which would add to this layer, or I could add something on top. So I could say a new video group, and now with this video group, I can add media to that, and I will go grab what I just downloaded and I'll stick it on, and it happens to be a very small size video file. So for this one, I am going to, it wants it to be a smart object if I'm going to transform it. So if I wish to transform this, we do need to convert it into a smart object. So with that, I will say convert, and now scale that up until it mostly fills the screen, and I'll say OK. So I'll undo the scale up. We can see there's the video playing in the timeline. Now this particular video, I'm going to stop it right at the start of the explosion. Click with the scissors. So now it splits it. Grab this part of the explosion and click with the scissors again, because I've now created a piece that I wish to work with. And now that particular piece of video that I have, I'm going to create a new video group and option drag it up, so that I now have, I'm creating multiple copies of my explosion because I can. And now with that selected, I can move one over. So we can add and wait for Photoshop to think. Again, Photoshop is not an ideal video editor, so there's a lot more thinking that goes on with it than if I am working with something like Adobe Premiere or even After Effects. But we have the capacity to cut the video, put the playback head where you want it, click the scissors, and it cuts it. Now, I have my different videos happening on screen as we work with it. We're able to not only add video and cut video and wait for Photoshop to think, but I can adjust the speed of video and the duration of this clip. We can see it's playing back at 100%. So if I wanted to take a particular clip, such as this clip, and slow it down, I could slow it down to, say, 50%. Hit enter to take effect, and now we can see how it's playing at a much slower rate. With that, I grabbed the wrong clip there. If I stretch it out, I can now stretch the clip. Okay, eventually it will work. I can stretch the clip out to see it playing in its slow motion. And then we have the faster version here. So again, it is multiple explosions as we play the video. So we can adjust the time on the video. Pictures are a little bit different because on the picture we have an option for adjusting motion. So motion is going to be different than just adjusting the speed. Under motion, you notice we have pan and zoom, rotate and zoom, just rotate, and just pan. So we have these options to work with. So if I say zoom on it, we can now zoom in and out, but I need to get to where I see my picture. Oh, that's right, it's turned off. Video group 1 was turned off. So here's video group 1 as it's doing its animation. And when I have that picture and it's spending a lot of time thinking, I'm just going to add to video group 3. Now, with this, if I just add a layer, we can see it added that layer at this point in time, and now that layer stretches out. And the reason I did that is to just have some fresh content so it's easier to see what is happening. So if I have layer 1 right here under motion, I could choose zoom, and we can choose zoom in on it. So it created a zooming effect. These options don't give you a ton of control as you work with it. They give you minimal control, but it's something. Again, this comes back to just because we can use Photoshop to do some of these things with video, it would be 100 times easier to do it in, say, Adobe Premiere or Adobe After Effects. when you learn the general user interface in the program, it would be easy to do it in there as well. It just, After Effects has a steeper starting learning curve to begin with. So we can insert our different elements in. We even have the capacity to add in audio, because we will see that there's an audio track here down at the bottom. In sound, I'm going to just point out one more thing on it is, so between my two videos, I have my video of the explosion going on, and now I have the big red X that's zooming in on screen. If I wanted to create a transition between those, the little black-white diagonal cut box up in my control bar of the timeline window gives me an option to fade, crossfade, fade with black, fade with white, or fade with the color. You can even choose the duration of what you want for that fade. So if I said crossfade, I can drag that over, and we can see the black box at those edges is showing me how long that fade is going to be as part of it. So now we can see how the one fades out and the other one shows up. So it does a crossfade. If I try one of the other ones, I could just drag out fade, and now that would fade that one in, and we can see the little ramp showing how it fades up. And I can adjust that ramp by going over to that edge, so I could make it happen quick, or I could stretch it out. And choose fade with black. So if we go here, we can see how that video fades to black. And if I go fade with black and drag it to the other side, we can see how that one now fades up from black. Notice how those fades are affecting the transparent pixels, or not affecting the transparent pixels on the layer, but only affecting the pixels that are opaque. So on this layer, that layer, the red pixels are opaque. The rest of it is not, so that's why it only fades that way. Now if I go into this layer and modify it, if I were to just use the paint bucket and just fill all these areas up, now when I go back, we can see how that it's fading from black. So if your both videos are full screen, and if you put a fade on each side, you get your ramps of how those fades are taking effect. So the fade is right over here. The final little bit of building your project would be to add in audio. We can have multiple audio tracks. Right now we'll just have one. I will choose add audio, and I will go grab my sound that I want to bring into my project. Okay, we can see there is the sound. Now what's nice about this with the sound is same way with the video, I can just move start and end points around as needed. So the music now plays when I hit play. It's part of what we have going on. If I right click on my sound, I can adjust the overall volume, and I can also tell my sound to fade in or fade out across its duration, which is nice. So if I want my sound to fade up over the course of 2 seconds, I can do that. Now if I go back to the beginning and hit play, you can see how it took 2 seconds for the sound to reach full volume. Can go to the end of the sound and do the same thing. At the end of a sound clip, you do have access. This little arrow, clicking on that brings up these options, but if you right click anywhere in the sound, it will also give you those same options. And you can choose to mute your audio while you're working, so you don't have to keep listening to it if you temporarily want to just mute it so it goes away. But you can also do it in the left-hand column over here as well. Getting the video rendered from your file is the final step. Oh, just want to point out, if you notice when I chose to exit or edit my red X, it created a new temporary file that I worked on. It showed me that file, and heck, for that matter, I can even add in additional layers into it. And now if I save that, I can just close it. And now if I go back into my file, you'll see how that is now part of that. Effectively, I have nested timelines going on now, which is kind of cool. But at the end of the day, we need to get our video out of here, because I'm not going to share a Photoshop file with someone. I'll share a video file with them. So before you try to get it out, I do want to save this. So I will save it. It's really important to save before you render, because during the export process, that's a common time for things to crash. So anytime you're doing saving out in Photoshop, that's probably the most unstable moment, that you need to make sure that your file is saved before you're trying to export it out. Now if I look, I have options here. Save as is not how I get it out. I'm exporting, and I'm exporting by choosing render video. Under render video, it pulls up this window. We can see it's similar to the frame one. We're choosing H.264 as our render option. We'll use Adobe Media Encoder. Now we could export it out as an image sequence that would render each frame of my video. So in this case, I'm doing approximately 30 frames per second. It would give me an image for each of those frames of video, and then I would have an image sequence that I could then use in other software. Sometimes for certain video effects or animation effects, we want a image sequence instead of an actual video file. But in this case, we will use the Media Encoder. We're going to make an H.264 file. We don't want QuickTime. We could shrink it down at this point. I could render it out at a smaller size. I could choose a different frame rate if I needed to, so it re-encodes it at a different frame rate, because video is time-based. So we can say my video is 10 seconds long. I could render it at 2997 frames. I could do 24. I could do 15. I could do 12. I could do pretty much whatever I want. Choose starting and ending frames. Once you have everything set, pay attention to where it's going to go. Mine's going on the desktop, and I will hit render, and we can see it's thinking, it's exporting, and once it's done exporting, I will be able to open up my video. The export process is complete. My finished video file has rendered out, and there's no audio with it because I did forget to reselect the audio layer after having muted it. And the explosion footage is a minute long, so that was continuing on long beyond the other elements I was working with in my timeline. So once again, in Photoshop, File, Export, Render Video is where we will get our video out. When I have a video group, if I want to add to it, I can choose Add Media. If I want to add in transitions, I can do that by clicking on the transition and dragging the transition I want to my timeline. If I want to split a video clip, I move my playback head where I want it, click on the scissors with my audio. If I want to fade in or out, right click, and then I can fade in or fade out as the case warrants. If I want to modify artwork that I have, I can double click. If it's a video file, I can double click, or a smart object, and add to it. If it's a normal layer, I can just modify it. After converting it to a smart object if I need to. And once it's a smart object, then I can go in and modify it. Save. Can close out of that, and now it will have modified that element. Could go to this video layer and do the same thing. So working with video in Photoshop is more of a novelty experience than it is a production workflow. But at some point in time, you may run into an occasion where it makes sense to do that as your workflow because it's faster than creating a video project in a program like Premiere. Good luck.